Hello, and thanks for joining me. You're listening to LOQPOD, which is powered by Loqbox. My name's Katy Ringsdore. So this week, I'm absolutely thrilled to be joined by Rosie Turner from Fintech for All and In Chorus. How would you prefer to be introduced, Rosie? Perhaps you should do your own introduction.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I definitely have two hats on there, so happy to kind of talk to you both. I guess to begin with, I am the co-founder of In Chorus and co-CEO, and In Chorus essentially is a tech for good business that's focused on how do we help companies, and I guess critically industries, to kind of re-engineer their approach to inclusion by ensuring that they have the data that enables them to kind of understand what some of their challenges are and how they can take more targeted action. So as In Chorus, we actually work across a couple of different industries, fintech and financial services definitely being one. And Fintech for All is specifically the work that we're consequently doing there that is really focusing on how are we working with organizations across the fintech sector in order to essentially create a more inclusive fintech environment.
And I'm also really excited to introduce B Gelda, who's the Chief of Staff at Loqbox. I've invited B on because she's got loads of experience in this kind of stuff, far more than me actually. So B, why don't you introduce yourself?
Yeah, thank you, Katy. So I'm relatively new to Loqbox, so I am the Chief of Staff. So my role is a really varied and exciting one. So I essentially support the C-suite in various programs and initiatives that they're doing that perhaps don't necessarily fit into another function in the organisation, but are really, really important either kind of for the growth and kind of success of the business or to the CEOs and kind of the general Loqbox family. So that might mean I'm working on strategies, how to break into a new market or find the blind spots in the US for our kind of expansion there. And equally means I get involved in things like this and talk to Rosie and kind of be involved in how we can really implement the advice and guidance and spirit of Fintech for All.
That's
so
perfect.
Thanks for having me.
No, thank you for joining us. I'm really, really pleased. It's quite interesting. It'll be the first time we've done one quite like this, so it's quite exciting for me, actually. So, Rosie, perhaps I'll start with you. You've mentioned the charter itself, which is how we met, because obviously, you went out there to try and get businesses involved in this Fintech for All charter. You've explained what it's about, but what surprised me a lot, the more we've kind of spoken about it, is how internally focused it is, actually. And, I think you guys touch on inclusivity for fintech generally, but it's more about kind of holding the mirror up to yourselves internally, isn't it? Can you give me a little bit more detail about the thought process behind the charter?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's it's actually really great to hear you kind of pick up on that point, because I think it's definitely something that was really critical to us, that this is, isn't just something that companies see as a tick box exercise or something that is done as a bit of a kind of PR stunt, but actually that is something that has real kind of data action and, like you say, that kind of reflection and self-work behind it. So where we kind of started was, we believe that when it comes to inclusion, most companies understand the importance of it. So, that it's really, really necessary in order to enable diverse talent to thrive, in order to create a culture where people want to work, but that actually, whilst there's a huge amount of goodwill around that word, there's a real lack of understanding as to what do we actually do? How do we translate that kind of goodwill into action? And I think that's been really challenging for a number of reasons. One, very much being, we still don't have a kind of agreement around what a data set or a way to measure or think about that is. And so that for us was really at the root of Fintech for All. We wanted to start with this piece of research that was looking into how do we help both the industry but then also companies to think about what is our actual culture like? What is the lived experience for different demographic groups? So not, the culture in terms of the values that are on the wall or the CEO statement, and all of these things obviously have an important role to play, but actually looking at the everyday behaviors, comments, actions, seeing what is tolerated day in, day out, and using that to say, when we look in the mirror at the bottom line, it's those behaviors that are shaping the culture. So we kind of began with a piece of research that was helping the industry to understand some of the most, challenging behaviours there, but then also really encouraging companies off the back of that to take action. So for us, like I say, we kind of began with this research piece that showed that there were considerable levels still of kind of everyday sexism, everyday racism that was affecting individuals within the sector. And then the charter was really created with our partners in response to that. So we were looking at what are kind of 5 very accessible but high impact asks that we can, hopefully engage fintechs of all different shapes and sizes. And what we do with those fintechs, I think, is really important and speaks to that point, is that when we begin to work with a signatory, we will spend a little bit of time understanding kind of where they are on their diversity and inclusion journey, because there is a huge spectrum. We're working with some quite small fintechs and also some very large ones. To say, where are you? What are your unique challenges? And then how can we begin to support you in kind of designing an action plan through those? So I think it's definitely that kind of leaning into data to understand the challenges and then using that data to drive action, and then over time measuring to see if that action has an impact is definitely the kind of the root of the way that we're trying to approach this.
Yeah, and that comes across really well, actually. And Bea, in a moment, I'm going to come on to you and ask you a little bit about your background and, the stuff that you've done in the past. But before I do that, Rosie, obviously you've started to have these conversations with companies. Do you feel like, and obviously I'm not expecting you to name names or anything like that, but do you feel that people or businesses are actually honest about the information they give you? Or do you think there's an element of self-protection and a bit of, ostrich head in the sand kind of approach? Or do you think you're getting a true picture so far?
Again, great question. So I think this is something that I'm very passionate about generally, actually, because I've been running in Chorus for nearly 2 years, and there's been a conversation that is full of gaps, I think. The word gap comes to mind regularly. And I think initially there was this huge gap between what companies were saying they were doing and what they were actually doing. That was definitely a painful one, and that still exists to some extent, but we've seen a huge shift in the last, I think, year even, between companies beginning to realise that mindset of trying to sweep things under the rug isn't a solution anymore. And I think certainly from our perspective, kind of post Black Lives Matter, the whole movement there, again, we've seen a radical shift in the way that people teams and HR teams are really beginning to say, actually, you know what, just talking about this isn't enough. We've got to lean into action and really doing something. So we're seeing the gap, I think, begin to move in the right direction and close out, which is really positive. But we definitely see still, I guess what could almost be seen as like a perception gap. And Accenture actually did some really interesting research around this, but it was looking at, so often when you ask senior leadership about how everything's going, they're like, oh, everything's fine, have a very positive view of kind of what the culture is. But then the reality of what that lived experience might be for different groups is often not necessarily the same. It can be a kind of perception gap there, a disconnect. And I think for us, that's something that we're really kind of focused on. It's how do we help companies to really understand from lots of different perspectives what's going on. And I think we've definitely got to the point where a lot more companies are really willing to look for where they may have those gaps or kind of blind spots almost. And there's more awareness around that, but I think we definitely still have a long way to go to really truly inviting those different perspectives into the conversation and shaping initiatives that would kind of really effective as a result. So yeah, we've made progress, but further to go, I think.
Yeah, and it goes back to what you were saying earlier about it not being a tick box exercise. You have to really want to be honest with yourself to actually make a difference, to have a greater impact. Bea, you and I have spoken about this sort of thing, often, because you and I, I think we kind of share a lot of similar approaches to the way we feel about diversity and inclusion, certainly within the workplace with your experiences. So how have you seen this in the past, and why do you think it's important for businesses like Loqbox, but also, from your other experiences, to actually sit back and think about things, to actually take action? What have you seen?
Yeah, of course. I suppose I'll break that into two questions. I suppose, why is it important? It's beyond it just being the right thing to do. the morally right thing to do, what feels good, and how we all kind of want the world, well, many of us want the world to be. I think for Loqbox in particular, and smaller kind of startup companies, I think it's important to be thinking about it at this stage, because we've got an opportunity to build in the kind of culture that we want to still be able to have and be proud of when we're bigger. And I think, on the tick box exercise, I think it's very easy to have policies in place, but actually your employees not really know where to go if, for example, they're being bullied or they're feeling uncomfortable in certain scenarios. And it's how you get everybody in the business thinking about diversity, about inclusion, and feeling safe and supported. And I think ultimately, as a rapidly growing company, that's having that diversity and creating the space for genuine inclusion is how you're going to innovate amazing products and have amazing teams, and ultimately produce something that you as a business can be really proud of and an industry can be really proud of, and that will be well received. Thinking about my experiences, I mean, as a human navigating the work world, I've had some horrible ones, of course. I had a brush with recruitment, which has essentially led to me doing a lot of internal recruitment by accident in businesses I've been in. And, it's true to say that there is the overt discrimination of, we can't afford maternity. So, can you confirm the relationship status of candidates I've put forward under the assumption that, a 30-something woman in a relationship with a mortgage may well be thinking about children soon, and that being considered a blocker for hiring. I think to also the very kind of subtle part of recruitment and hiring from a diversity perspective, where you tend to look at what works and replicate it. So you then create a job description that is for a particular person. You search CVs for that particular person. You create an interview process that suits that particular person. And I think that can be really easy to fall into. And I know that I have done that in the past. And it's something that as businesses you can put some really simple strategies in place. Have 2 or 3 people involved in writing job descriptions and job specifications, potentially post 2 job adverts, remove names from CVs, or even education, because I think generational diversity is something that can be overlooked. And I think it's very easy. It's not difficult. You look at the date somebody left school, you get your fingers out, you count, and you go, oh, well, actually, we've got a really high energy, enthusiastic sales team, and already you're putting in these subtle blockers that may prevent you from hiring somebody in their 50s who's going to be fantastic at the job and really kind of change the culture and drive it forward. I think there's loads that can be done, and I think it's inclusion, I think, is the step that I'm really interested in hearing about, because it's how you lift that off paper and outside of the training and really, really take the steps and put the plans into place to make sure that, you not just have a great diverse meeting so you can see your numbers, you've got women in leadership and you've got a really diverse group of people, that actually, people are really feeling included, and that's kind of continuing to grow.
Yeah, and I thought that was really interesting what you said about recruitment, because there is an unconscious bias, and we do, humans, we make assumptions, rightly or wrongly, whether we like to think we're good people or not, we do it. I think everybody does. Rosie, what more can we be doing at that earlier stage to stop that and actually step away? And I mean, looking at fintech specifically, I mean, you see a much greater proportion of men working within the fintech space than you do women, and that's by nature of the fact of the split. And certainly within, in a financial institution, you can have, I think, a fairly varied gender, I'm speaking gender specifically right now, but a gender split because of the nature of the roles. Whereas in fintech, you see a lot more of the kind of DevOps side, coders, which is a far more male-oriented part of the business. What more can be done at the recruitment stage to increase diversity?
I think it's super important and super interesting, and I think it is definitely a question that we hear a lot, and it's something that we've recently kind of experienced, even just the pain point of, as in chorus, we've been hiring tech roles, and I've been astonished to go through that process myself and realise, we had hundreds of applications and so few women for tech roles, and it really is still challenging. I think, for early stage companies, there's definitely kind of, as Bea was saying, I think being aware of it is actually a key part of the problem. Being really aware of it really early on, realizing who you are, understanding a bit more culture, like what your individual biases might be, and trying to put in place structured processes early on that protect us against the biases that we all have. So I think there's a key part there. There's then definitely just, as part of those kind of foundational stepping stones, essentially also making sure that the kind of job description itself is written in a way that hopefully appeals more to diverse candidates. I know there are various kind of tools that you can process job descriptions through now. We'll look at kind of the language you're using and how it might be kind of better worded. And then reaching out widely, looking for job boards and communities where you can share that in order to try and kind of, I guess, boost that access. But it is a really difficult one because ultimately it goes back to, a way earlier problem, right down. It starts in schools, it progresses into universities, and then it filters out into the world. And I think this is something actually that, as in chorus, we're kind of looking at a lot. It's how do those micro behaviours that, when we're talking about inclusion, connect to some of these macro challenges that we have, like systemic racism, systemic sexism. So often, we're looking at these really messy problems and kind of zooming in on parts of them, but they really are kind of hugely complex. So as Fintech Rule, we have a steering committee where kind of Innovate Finance, the FCA, Fintech Alliance, Number 39 sit, and I know Innovate Finance has recently done some really great work with Fintech for Schools, which is really looking at this challenge of how can we increase kind of early access and mentorship, and then try and encourage, I guess, greater diversity coming into the sector. So I think that's all super important from the recruitment side. And then the piece that we're then really focusing on is how do we also think about the culture? Because I think people subconsciously have that perception coming in of, I don't know, instinctively, maybe I'm not going to belong here. I don't see as many people that look like me. Those cultures can very much become kind of self-perpetuating too. So again, a lot of the work that we're looking to do around gathering data around these lived experiences is how can we really understand what's going on there, so that we can hopefully improve that and certainly retain talent that does join, because that's another challenge we see is people throwing diversity at the problem of diversity, if that makes sense. Hiring it, not retaining it, and then having to hire it again. And we're saying, well, actually, how do we really make sure that we're building this, far more inclusive culture where hopefully we don't undo kind of the good work that is being done.
Yeah, and I thought it was really interesting what you just said there about going back to the schools, but it's also making me think about the future. If we go back to where the problems perhaps start and challenge those, I then think further down the line, when all of this good work's done, what does good look like? When will this no longer be something that we're having a discussion about? I mean, do either of you have a view on that? Perhaps Bea, do you want to start?
Such a big question, and I think it's easy to step back and all of a sudden feel overwhelmed at what that might actually look like. I think, Rosie, you are so right in thinking about, say, gender-specific inclusion, and I've been there trying actively to bring females into a company, amazing companies that are desperate for female talent, and not being able to find that talent, and if that is the case, I think there's been some studies recently of statistics of asking teenagers, their expected careers, and it's actually happening far beyond any consideration of whether they're actually applying for roles. If I'm completely honest, I was talking to my partner last night that I don't know, there's part of me that thinks, is it ever going to happen?
Mm.
That's it. It really does feel like that. But Rosie, go ahead.
No, I think it's quite an uncomfortable thing to actually stare at. Like, how does this really, when you look at some of those stats here, you look at like hundreds of years to close between the pay gap, and even we haven't even started on an ethnicity pay gap yet. Like you say, we know that biases, discrimination are kind of baked into our society so early on, and actually a lot of this kind of sparks again quite recently for me, and it's slightly different, but I guess parallel case with and the kind of tragic disappearance and ultimately murder, and again this kind of outcry of in this specifically women, talking about safety on the streets, and just when does this change? How does this happen when somebody theoretically does everything, in inverted commas, right, and something, so horribly awful can still take place? And I think it really does, it hammers home again how far we are from from where we all want to be as a society. I think that for me personally, there is this combination of looking at it and thinking about it as a kind of, I guess, systems problem, looking at all these different aspects, thinking about the work that is done in schools, how are we approaching that? Actually, again, on a tangent, my mum was actually a teacher and is very, very interested in this work in schools. She does a lot of work in primary schools. I'm actually from the north of England, so it's quite a small primary school, but they're amazing already. And the conversations that she's now trying to bring into the classroom through literature, through text, is so different to anything we experience. And I think it's so exciting to see that. And I'm really hopeful that, with the generations coming up, that there is going to be a kind of a much greater awareness of who we are, what our biases are, and how we're interacting with others. I think it really all starts from that point of awareness. And again, I think the data that we're looking at in an industry level, the data that we're encouraging companies to get at a company level, it's all really about how can we begin to look at this, see it for what it is, and open up those conversations. Because I think only when we do that are we hopefully going to keep the progress moving forward. Because otherwise we're all just stuck where we are. But I mean, massive long-term challenges and change still. To look at, you need the kind of 50-year vision, but you also just need to do something tomorrow, because otherwise it is easy kind of overwhelmed to just go, oh my gosh, I can't win this on a short-term goal, so I'll just kind of park it for now. And actually, I think that's a really dangerous kind of mentality. So keeping that kind of momentum is key.
I mean, it's a question just for Rosie, which I can bring up later, which is, I think having that awareness is really, really important. And I think I've recently been doing a bit of research and a study on something else. And in creating the questions that I wanted to understand about others, it actually made me really look at my own experience and actually the small things that are kind of happening throughout my day that actually paint this bigger picture. And I wonder if, through the data that you're collecting, the mere asking those questions and asking, teams to engage with those questions actually perhaps forces you to look at your own situation for the really small things that on a day-to-day basis, you just accept them as they are, and I think that forced or encouraged, not forced, encouraged reflection is something that's really, really key to kind of bringing awareness across businesses, rather than just the appointed person to kind of look at diversity and inclusion. Would you say that you find that whilst you're carrying out your questionnaires and conversations?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's a great point, actually, because one thing we've had to kind of grapple with is, and it has moved a long way, that is, what is the kind of shared language around some of these behaviours? So we often use the term kind of microaggressions, microaffirmations, looking a lot at these small kind of, they can be subtle, they can be quite overt, but everyday commonplace behaviors, comments, actions that are, hostile to a specific individual or group. But there's often, whilst when you start to give examples, so for example, it might be when you're the only woman in the room and you're always asked to make the tea or take notes. Or it could be somebody questioning, no, but really, where are you from? Because they can't accept that you were actually born and bred in Putney. These kind of subtle points that really we're all experiencing day in, day out. But a lot of people, like you say, they're just so much part of our day to day that you're not necessarily conscious of them. And so when we're working with a company, we often do a little bit of work up front, which is really around developing a shared language around what these behaviors are. Because actually, you're right, when you then start to have a language to talk about them with others, you start to be able to reflect on them, see those moments in your own day and feel validated that it was a real thing, and it's okay that you had a response to it. Because I think that's something else we often see is, because there's often this ambiguity as to whether it was, maybe somebody didn't intend to cause any harm, or maybe you were being too sensitive, or these are often questions that we see people kind of grappling with as they try to process what happened and why do I feel this way about it. Also, it's often cumulative, right? So you might have quite a strong emotional response to one specific incident, but it might be because it's the 50th time that it's happened this month. So, it's already disappeared in the blur of your busy work. So yeah, kind of encouraging people to be able to reflect on encouraging people to reflect on those specific instances, and kind of own those, but also really helping workplaces to begin to spot where they might be happening elsewhere, so that people can be more effective bystanders, and also just open up those conversations internally is definitely like a critical piece around this. Yeah, completely agree.
Yeah, and also, just to add to that, I think Bea and I mentioned this off air when we first had a bit of a chat about this. It's about normalising the policies and procedures, because a lot of the time, certainly from my experiences in the past, you join a business, you read through all of the, anti-bullying, acceptable behaviours, policy. But do you actually take it in? Does that change the way you behave? Does that influence the way you behave? Probably not. And it's only when it becomes a problem. I think, Bea, you actually raised this. I'm not going to take credit for it. But it's only when it becomes a problem, you then go back to those policies and procedures and you look at what is deemed to be correct and what isn't correct. And then the process you then have to follow. At what point do these policies and procedures become normal, everyday practice, so it doesn't have to get to the point of bad for it to become culturally acceptable, culturally real? I don't really know how to phrase it. I mean, what's the dream?
Yeah, I think it's a great point. We definitely, around this whole topic, we feel very strongly that it's often left too late, right? It's allowed to become too big a problem. We often see companies might have some kind of formal grievance procedure or whistleblowing tool, but the problem there is really, by the time that most people access it, it's about kind of damage control. An individual, there's always hurt, basically, and the resolution is rarely a win-win in that situation. I guess right down at the other end of the spectrum, employees are often using kind of engagement tools or surveys, but the problem there, it can very much be a case of they're not happening very frequently, or you're only getting an answer to a specific question. And I think what we're kind of really interested in advocating for is how can you be listening more continuously so that you are able to do exactly that. One, kind of embed that policy, make it not just something that is actioned in a worst case scenario, but actually, these smaller everyday behaviors become very important. They kind of too critically spot where problems might be emerging before they become big problems. So yeah, becoming far more preventative, far more proactive, and a lot less kind of reactionary, which is the way that I think companies have typically had to manage this previously. And yeah, kind of excited to see that shift, because for me, that's the win. It's when actually we can begin to have these conversations so much earlier that we stop some of the really painful things happening, rather than just we get way better at managing it once it's happened. That doesn't feel like the ultimate win from my perspective.
Yeah, agreed. And it would be great if we eventually got to that point. I mean, Bea, have you had any, obviously we've talked about experiences in the past and, perhaps some fairly negative situations, but have you kind of come across any really decent, good practice that you could perhaps maybe share that others could take influence from? What's worked really well for you?
Yeah, that's a great question. And one that I'll probably, sadly, need to rack my brain a little bit deeper for than I would like, which I think is the illustration as to exactly why this conversation is so important. I have been in a business where there has, unfortunately, instances have been left too late. And whilst that was, I think, a deeply saddening experience for everybody involved, it prompted the enthusiasm and motivation that perhaps should have been the attitude from the start line. I think, again, I think, Rosie, you raised a really interesting point about listening and encouraging conversation. I've worked in places where we've set up a kind of honesty box that's open and safe for all suggestions, and really tried to encourage kind of individuals to share their anecdotes and everything, and we would kind of read them through and filter them, and that might be something whereby it's being in a largely male environment, and recognizing that you are the only person that walks in the office every day to be greeted by compliments, but that fundamentally are about your appearance. And it's a really small aspect of your day, and at first maybe it feels really great, and then all of a sudden you feel that sense of, I don't feel as respected as my colleagues because I'm glamorous, and they're just asked how their day is. And so, as an example, we've used that in the past, and it's been really effective, and then actually has altered, that's been delivered anonymously to the business as a whole, as let's try and minimize these kind of comments, in order to, essentially fulfill a request that has been made. And I think that's worked really well. And I think it's probably a question for Rosie and for all of us is how we encourage that listening and that sharing, and creating valid actions from that as to actually what is the very next step that we can take. Rosie might have some great suggestions for Loqbox as to what we really can do as the next step.
No, I think that's actually, it's an awesome example, and I think as a concept that's so similar to what we're achieving, I guess, within Chorus at scale, in terms of those small, very carefully actually, because they're not always small, but those moments whereby kind of behaviours that are causing individuals upset, frustration, hurt, whatever it might be, can be surfaced. And really what we're doing is we're enabling an individual to anonymously flag an incident like that. So you might be able to capture, I'm frustrated that every day when I walk in the office I receive comments on my appearance, and actually, whilst this might be intended as a compliment, it doesn't make me feel that. It makes me feel inferior, or that I'm not taking this seriously. What we're looking to do is very much catch that scale. So we're looking at the patterns and trends of these kinds of behaviours across different locations, different teams, different functions within a business, to begin to see where there might be those kind of problematic areas. And then for us, it really is a case of leaning into that data, looking to see what some of the kind of the key issues that emerge are. And I think, almost coming back to our point before, of like, sometimes these problems can be so overwhelming, where do you start? I think we're really keen on helping businesses to understand that broader context, but also to zoom in on where can you start. Okay, what are some of the most pressing issues that if you began to resolve it would be really powerful? And so we often find that our data will normally throw up maybe 3 issues. It could be something just like that. And then really it's the case of the company, sometimes we work with them, sometimes the company will look at it themselves to see what a next step might be. And I think so often, particularly with smaller companies, that awareness is enough. And like you say, actually just joining up the dots and having that conversation, going to the managers, going to line managers and saying, you know what, you probably have really positive intentions perhaps when this is being said or communicated, but it's actually having this impact. And sometimes it's literally as simple as clearing up that communication channel. And that's hugely powerful then when you begin to realize that, you know, some of the problems that we're surfacing or looking at surfacing don't require hundreds of thousands of pounds of L&D budget and expensive rollout. Like, no, it can sometimes it's literally communication. Other times, you know, we do see problems emerging that might look particularly troubling. There might be lots of behaviours, comments that lean much more strongly towards kind of quite overt sexual harassment or kind of racial discrimination. And then, you know, one thing that we're really seeing companies doing is rather than going and just rolling out some generic training course, taking their data and working with a consultant to say, okay, we've got a clearer understanding of what is going on within our company, what the challenges are, how can we work with you to design something that's very targeted to us and our challenges. And I think that's something that's quite exciting when we think about kind of diversity and inclusion, how it's approached, very much leaning into that kind of data-led strategy, and also then to be able to track. And I guess this point's really key. How do you then measure over time to see whether that change that you made had a positive effect? And that's something that, again, we're really excited and kind of encouraging companies to kind of look towards.
Well, both, I've absolutely loved this chat today. Thank you so much for your time. And before I let you go, Rosie, if other fintech businesses, because I know you do a lot with Innovate Finance and they're great at the support that they give you to push this and the FCA as well, but how can other people get in touch or learn more about the charter specifically if they needed to?
Definitely. So the best place is probably to go to fintech.inchorus.org. And there's quite a bit of information there about how you can reach out, how you can join as a signatory, and upcoming kind of events and ways to get involved. We definitely love to connect with anyone. I stress fintechs of all different shapes and sizes are welcome and actively encouraged. But Katy, huge thanks for this. It's been really fun.
Thank you. And Bea, really appreciate your view on and you sharing your experiences today as well. So thank you both very much indeed.
Thank you very much.